Hello, friends, and welcome to C Club's podcast. I'm your host, Jess. Today we have something special. We have a new thing. Welcome to the first episode of the DAO Contributor Series, where we sit down with the early full-time contributors in Web3 to shine a light on some of the pain points, the day-to-day operations, and what it's like to actively be building on the front lines in the future of work on the internet. Today we are very excited to be joined by Patti Hauseman, who runs operations at a little DAO you might know called FWB. We speak to Patti about her journey entering into the Web3 space and how she worked her way through FWB into a full-time role. We go deep into the onboarding process at FWB and how those pathways have evolved. Talk about her experience building healthcare options for the contributors, something that is going to be relevant for many DAO operators today. Patti is a passionate, thoughtful contributor to the DAO ecosystem, and we are so lucky to have her sharing her insights with us here today. So let's jump into it.
Amazing. So thank you for including me, and we are definitely overdue for a conversation. As you probably know, I don't get out of my own DAO very much. So crazy busy. And I've had the good fortune of meeting a lot of really nice people through Zang. Zang usually sends folks my way when it comes around to operational questions.
Yes.
But I literally barely get out of my own DAO right now.
Well, that's spoken like a true quality operations person in a DAO.
It's complicated. DAO operations is a lot more complicated than I think people understand, except for the operations people.
Yes. Okay. Well, so much to get into. Let's start off the top. What's your background? Who are you? Maybe give us a little bit of an intro.
Sure. So I'm Patti Hauseman. I am the operations lead at FWB DAO. In my previous life, I've been a longtime music industry person, including GMing a couple of indie labels, working at some major labels, and most recently I ran the recorded music division of Paradigm Talent Agency. We had our own in-house label there before coming to FWB.
I love how much of a crossover there is between music and Web3, and I think, again, that's something that people who have spent time in music and Web3 can sort of understand. Maybe the drive to the complexities of that industry. I'm curious, like, what was that discovery moment for Web3 and DAOs for you?
So my onboarding to FWB, from my music life, I actually knew Trevor. And I ended up onboarding to FWB wanting to learn more about NFTs back a little over a year ago. But I'd never owned any crypto before. Trevor airdropped me the tokens to join. I joined FWB, and I had this moment in the DAO of just discovering this entire world that I knew absolutely nothing about. There were so many people building in the space, so many people working on new things, so many smart thinkers. You know, we're so lucky at FWB to have the quality members that we have. There was just so many amazing people and so many things to learn. I basically moved in. And that was sort of the moment. And I volunteered for the membership committee. And then from there, I ended up becoming in charge of the membership team. And then from there, I ended up shifting to an operations role. That's sort of my journey to Web3. But, you know, honestly, the past 10 years for me in music has felt really stale. I feel like the limited resources that music has now versus back when the recorded music industry sort of had a heyday really limits the innovation that the industry does, where Web3 just feels like constant innovation. It's so exciting and it's so exhilarating to sort of be part of it. But I think the Web3 to music industry crossover is music is not, or at least the industry is not particularly structured, right? There's not a lot of structure where if you go into like an agency or one of the big Web2 sort of behemoths, one of the FANG companies, it's super corporate, it's super structured. I feel like music people really adapt to DAOs because we can deal with sort of that a little bit more of a free-flowing structure compared to someone who needs a more structured environment.
Yeah, I also find that how effed up the space is also has a direct correlation to the willingness of people to take risks and do new things. And I think music is I mean, across the board at all levels has such a mismatch of incentives and complications to it that, yeah, I think there's this like mixture of structurelessness and then also an appreciation for how certain structures can maybe be limiting.
Yeah,
Does that check out?
100%, 100%. Yeah, I think, and that sort of leads back into the sort of lack of innovation, right? Because parts of it, especially the rights part of it, is so structured. It just doesn't feel like there's a lot of room for innovation there unless you're one of the rights holders.
Totally. I spent 2 years working for a management and booking agency in Canada here. So I had a very up close and personal understanding of many of those complications in the music business. So shared history.
Yeah, for sure. I think the industry as a whole is going to be able to really benefit from Web3, and it's going to be so nice to cut out some of the middle men in this space. I mean, there's still going to be the gatekeepers. I think it's going to be challenging to sort of see a world where some type of label doesn't exist because they have the team to do things like marketing, et cetera, et cetera. But I think Web3 is really going to help shift the paradigm. I love hearing from artists. I sold 3 music NFTs or 4 music NFTs last year, and it paid me more than my entire label paid me the duration of my contract.
It's wild. I agree. Well, I love something that you said there around, how you started contributing to Friends with Benefits. And I think you said, I kind of just moved in, and I chuckled at that because when I think about some of our early contributors and impactful contributors at C Club, that's very much like maybe not the way that I would have described it, but I think it's a fair description. Folks kind of like almost all consumed by the excitement that's happening and the opportunity that's happening in the organization. And they kind of move in and just start looking for ways to contribute. I'm curious how you sort of contrast that early stage, sort of your finding your footing and participation in FWB with maybe how people are onboarding today. Is it consistent or has it changed a bit?
I think it's changed a bit. I was really fortunate because FWB was smaller. We were still thinking through our structure. I think now our structure is a bit more formalized, where I think there are clearer paths. I wouldn't say there's completely clear paths to contribution, but there are much clearer paths than when I onboarded to FWB. There's, a product team, there's an events team, there's editorial. When I onboarded, I think membership was probably the first team, and there wasn't any sort of contributors beyond the source cred model prior to that.
Can you give us like a high level overview of like of what FWB looks like from a structure perspective, specifically thinking about this idea of like how potential contributors become contributors, and maybe laying out that groundwork would be helpful there.
So FWB consists of, probably 8 to 10 teams at this point. And I think the contributor flow is really around either tapping people in the community that we know have expertise in the areas that we're working in, or folks raising their hands in a way to contribute. So the one thing that's nice about membership is the membership team is one of the few areas in FWB where you don't have to have any expertise at all. And that's where I started. The product team, you do need to have some either engineering skills or design skills. So we try to match folks with the right teams for them to hope, to try to work through what success looks like for both the team and the contributor.
One of the things that maybe this tension that exists in these DAOs and is in the process of being proven out, but let's just say on one side of the divide, there's like open, permissionless, huge organizations. You hold tokens, you can be a part of it. Emergent behavior is rewarded. The DAO provides a bunch of resources, and it's up to human beings to come together and make use of them. And maybe I put bankless DAO as a good example of that. And then on the opposite end, there's maybe these smaller product team DAOs that are like 5 or 7 people, and they're very focused on building product. And there's a fairly high bar to joining that team. There's specific talent and skills required to be able to contribute effectively in that small team. I'm curious about how you guys sort of think about maybe the tension that lives in the middle there, which is this desire to create a pathway for more and more people to participate. The thesis there maybe being that ownership and participation is the best way to really drive deep, sticky connections within an organization. And also the maintaining of an appropriate quality bar or level of talent required to actually execute on some of the more specific things that you're building. Is that a tension you guys feel, and how are you thinking about it?
Yeah, it is a tension we feel, but I will say, the feedback that I think we're getting is most people that want to contribute in an impactful way. And that becomes more challenging to find opportunities for folks. Contributing in an impactful way versus doing something like making a quick flyer are two different models. So, we lean a little bit more towards the second model that you talked about. We're not super flat yet like Bankless is, and Bankless is probably one of the most high functioning DAOs that are as flat as they are. They're really a marvel to me every day. I think we're taking a slower path to try to make sure that we consistently put out great output, but that also means for us that we're a little bit slower in onboarding contributors to teams than someone like a Bankless.
And how would you think about the trade-offs that are happening there for somebody who's, maybe let's put them into a contributor point of view. One side, it might be very easy to, I was kind of laughing. I don't know if it's easy to join Bankless DAO and participate. I think there's like a lack of clarity can be challenging there, though holding tokens kind of gets you in the door, and it's up to you to figure out how you can participate versus like the more managed structure that you have here. Like, is there a recommendation there? Like, how do people find their way? Do you think it's easier to get involved in one that has a little bit more structure, or are you a big fan of just throwing people into the deep end and saying, go figure it out?
I would say it's probably easier to get involved with something with not as much structure. I can't speak to how impactful the experience will be as a contributor, which I think are two different things, right? And I want to sort of be thoughtful here around how I impact this. I think in some DAOs, anyone can raise their hand and spin something up, and it doesn't necessarily feel like it's aligned with the sort of moving vision of the DAO overall. It's almost like a caterpillar with a bunch of legs going in a bunch of different directions. We're having all of our teams and the contributors all on those teams pulling together in one direction, I think, again, sort of allows us to perform at sort of a higher level. And I think that ends up being more impactful for the contributors.
Interesting. It's a conversation that has been coming up a bunch for us around maybe less so about structure and more so about clarity of objectives or mission, or like in a traditional organization, you're going to have senior leadership teams that are setting these strategic directions, and then that's kind of being put down into a division level and yada, yada. And that almost seems to be the place where you actually get a bunch of worldview friction, if you will, in DAOs, in that clarity of direction is absolutely essential. It's probably more essential in a more decentralized organization, because otherwise, how do you know that you're actually contributing something of value? And I totally agree. This idea of like, people want to be impactful. That's 100%. Low-level bounty doesn't do it for most people. They want to be impactful. So I'm curious about that sort of like strategic direction piece there. How are you guys managing getting clarity around the high level right now at FWB?
We're really lucky. We have a lot of great team leads that all really, again, I'm thankful every day that I work with the folks that I work with. But I think we have a lot of team leads that are aligned in sort of the overall vision of FWB. So we all collectively discuss a lot of the priorities as a group to try to figure out what some of the best and smartest paths forward are for the DAO. I think Zhang does an incredible job architecting the strategies with the teams, but really the teams are super involved in architecting the entire DAO structure. And if we're all communicating together, which we typically do a pretty good job of, we do a good job in guiding the DAO in the direction that collectively we think is the right path.
Can you give us a bit of an insight into your operational organizational structure? Like, what I read in what you're saying there is like there's this consensus building off-chain through conversation, and kind of like this direction kind of starts to emerge from these talented human beings that have like their own areas of expertise and insight feeding up into the DAO level. But how are you managing your operations on a maybe daily, weekly, quarterly cadence? Are there weekly calls that you're doing with your team leads? I'm just trying to get a bit detailed there.
Sure. Teams have their own calls every week. Then we have calls with the entire teams, and then we've got smaller strategy. And by the way, we all kind of work through these strategies as a group, But ultimately, we do need to make the case to the DAO, which we do in town halls. And then we still put a lot of these decisions to a snapshot vote to make sure that all of the members of the DAO are aligned with the vision of the teams. And so far, we've had really good luck with that. It's been nice sort of starting with soft consensus before pushing to a vote. The soft consensus usually pushes us and lets us know if we're taking the wrong path. And we've had that come up a few times where we've regrouped and pushed through working through community feedback to get us back on the right path. But yeah, it's the teams have their own meetings. We have a large group team meeting. We do town halls across the DAO, and then we have weekly strategy meetings.
I love that. I think that there's like a lot of value in just clearly articulating that organization. I think people have a lot of experience in joining a company. And while I think many of these organizations DAOs are still pulling on a lot of that insight and experience on how to build companies and operate as human beings, since they are still human beings, I think there's like a lot of uncertainty or a feeling of lack of clarity for new contributors that are coming in. And in listening to how you're explaining the operations of FWB, like it's very simple in many ways, and yet I think it's extremely valuable for people to sort of see that there's work happening on sort of more of a micro level. That stuff gets fed up into this sort of broader consensus building strategy layer that then is ultimately sort of engaged in a governance process. And that the idea of sort of like a gut check through a soft consensus vote that then moves, a proposal forward through to ultimate ratification from the DAO. Like all that stuff, I think it's almost magic to many people. And yet when you're in it, it can almost seem like just the most basic stuff. So
Yeah, it's so funny. Like listening to you sort of articulate that process, I'm sitting here amazed that we have such a strong process that seems so well thought out. But you're correct. In the thick of it, it just seems like we're doing our thing.
yeah, it's got to do your thing. I'm curious how you guys think of governance, because there seems to be like this broad spectrum that's being experimented with right now out in the ecosystem. On one end is like everything goes up for a snapshot vote and certain outcomes or chaos ensues. On the opposite side, there's like, core teams that are making a lot of decisions and maybe there's quarterly budgets that are being voted on a DAO level. How have you guys sort of thought about the trade-off between sort of making a process public versus, how deeply do you want people to be involved in that governance process, or are they today?
So I think, sort of small stake stuff, we trust the teams to make good decisions. Most of the time when we go to a snapshot vote, it's about a treasury disbursement. Every so often, it will be a non-treasury snapshot, but for the most part, it's a snapshot vote, and it's typically over, I'd say, probably around $20,000 is where it is. And I think it depends on the initiative. So, for example, the digital events team, they present their budget quarterly, which I think is reasonable because we want to book digital programming a quarter at a time. But there may be one-offs where we're hosting an event or we're making a change to membership that will go through the snapshot process to make sure we record the consensus for the future.
That's interesting. When I think about governance, I think that like the core focus should be about legitimacy building. And I think the way that you articulated that as like recording that consensus on chain for the future is maybe like the right way of even framing ultimately what legitimacy building is, and that we can say at this point in time, we made this decision and henceforth agreed upon, and we can sort of move forward with it. But I think there's also like, I've looked to FWB and how you're even thinking about rolling out monthly budgets or quarterly budgets and like the level of detail that goes into those or not, I think is actually, it seems very thoughtful, and that a lot of work seems to be going on behind the scenes in these smaller teams that are bubbling up to a vote. And I think that's a good example of sort of a thoughtful approach to governance, right? Where there can be too much involvement in governance, and especially since there's an immense amount of information asymmetry that exists, especially when you're dealing with sort of these smaller teams. And so, I point to FWB often as saying, well, here's a thoughtful way of ensuring that you're building that legitimacy in governance. The DAO is ultimately in control. And also there's sort of this feeding up of information from the edges that is higher signal because of the amount of asymmetry that just exists in operating anything.
Right. Exactly. I mean, it's important to us. The budget's a great example of that because everything gets recorded and put up for a vote in the budget. So it allows us to course correct if anyone sees anything that looks out of place. And while we try to optimize for consensus, we do try to make sure that we're also listening to individual concerns as well, just to make sure that everyone feels like they have a say in the process.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Like, is there an example of that or how that works?
We do have a lively governance channel, and most of our members feel comfortable enough to pop into our DMs if they've got questions around things or if they've got opinions around things. I think, sort of going back to the contributor on-ramp, I think one of the biggest questions is usually how can folks get more involved? We really do try to move towards soft consensus, and that also goes with all the way through to our team meetings and things like that, where we'll think we have a game plan and you'll have a few people on the team flag their concerns, and suddenly we realize, well, maybe we were off on the wrong path. The one thing that's just been really nice about working with the FWB team is I can't say that there's a single person on the team that always feels like they know the exact right way to do things in DAO world. So everything stays really fluid and really flexible in our space for the most part.
I love that. And I think it also speaks to the importance of, or some of the value you can get out of being thoughtful about how you bring in core team members. And there's sort of like this a hiring for culture piece that I think is deceptively important in DAOs, in that you don't have that hierarchical control. And so that the tools that you have to actually make decisions, stay focused, etc., are less hierarchy based and much more consensus based and culturally based. And so it sounds like the culture that's being built there at FWB is one that values a lot of things that are ultimately allow for the flexibility and direction and effectiveness that you guys are sort of leaning into.
Yeah, it's hard for me to sort of articulate just how impressive the group of folks at FWB are. It's unlike anywhere I've ever been a part of. So I feel super lucky every day.
I feel the exact same way about the Seed Club team. And I think that might be one of like the most exciting opportunities for potential contributors today, is to find amazing communities that they feel very aligned with and find an opportunity to work with those folks, because I have the exact same feeling. And I talk to many other people that are sort of operating in this space right now, where it's just this privilege to be doing the work we're doing, but even more of a privilege to be doing it with the people we're doing it with.
100%. And to me, it wouldn't be the same. Doing the work wouldn't be the same without the people we're all doing it alongside.
Yeah, totally agree. One of the most prominent DMs I get, I'm assuming you as well, is from people who say that they love everything that your DAO is all about and would love to know how to contribute more. Help me contribute more. And I think they're seeing this in the market more generally, as there's this talk about onboarding and there's tools and how do we get, the next million people into DAOs. And, in an operational context, there's this very real challenge that is less about finding maybe great talent, but more about finding useful, high impact ways for people to contribute. How have you sort of navigated that world where I'm assuming you're getting more demand to do work than you actually have space for?
We do. We have more hands up than we have roles, but I think we're sort of shifting towards something new that we started last season. We've launched a proposal review team to allow contributors to pull together their own proposal to launch their own initiative. So whether it's, we had some members working on an FWB cookbook, which is so rad. We had others that ended up sponsoring, and the community voted on a universal basic income test for a season. I think the solution is not as much finding roles for people on existing teams as it is for allowing people and teams, or maybe not allowing, but making sure they understand there's permission for existing folks to push through their own initiatives that can be part of the FWB family.
Got it. So there's almost creating more of structure and examples that show people how they can go and take initiative and make something exist. So I think that's in our worldview at Seed Club, the highest value thing a contributor can do is take responsibility for an initiative. And it's something that we reward, and that's core team members are taking that responsibility. But folks coming together around a proposal is the ultimate version of that. There's being there from the inception of something is probably the best way to identify those folks that could be high impact, but also create that tight bond between idea and proposal and project and the individual creators.
Fully agree. Fully agree. I think too, making sure folks understand that they have the opportunity to create their own role or roles within the DAO, provided the community supports it, I think is super powerful. I think it's so powerful. And then it comes through, it ends up coming down to the execution, right? To see whether or not that role or that proposal will pick up enough traction and garner enough support for it to become sort of a permanent entity within the DAO.
I'm curious how you, as an organization, are measuring that success. The OKRs and KPIs of our past were there for a reason, right? There's sort of like a common language and a focus and a way of sort of measuring progress. How is that done in FWB today?
We're doing some of the same things where each team is setting some goals for themselves to try to meet season by season. Some goals are more important than others, but I think sitting down and collectively talking through those goals with the strategy team and having some support from the strategy team on those goals is super helpful in that regard. And we're pushing things through the same way. This is our first season doing it, so we'll see where things land at the end of the season.
Can you zoom in a little bit on like how you would imagine operationalizing some of like the measurement? And this is a very selfish conversation because it's something that we're also early stages in, but it sounds like this idea of a team articulating a goal and then say that goal isn't hit. How do you sort of manage that process, or is there a formal process there?
We haven't made it through that to that point yet, but I think the first thing would be trying to understand why it didn't happen. And if it's something that makes sense, that's something that's reasonable, I think it just gets added to the following season's goal. And then if it's something that, if there's a reason for not hitting the goal that seems less valid than there being a blocker out of your control, I would imagine there'll be conversations. We haven't had that happen yet.
A, I love that answer because like that's the truth of figuring all this stuff out. And then B, like, I think so much of what we're doing right now is this sort of collective learning. There's so much value in these organizations that are out there on the edges trying to figure this out because it is different enough that there are new methods and models and processes that I think need to be developed. And so even thinking through practically how are we improving on a season by season basis, I think is an essential sort of function for these organizations. And it is one that would normally live in sort of a management suite. And now I think needs to be sort of brought down into a team by team basis. Well, I mean, it probably should have always been in a team by team basis. I often describe building a DAO as having two products. Like one might be the membership and the social site or social sort of context that you're building. And then two is the DAO itself. Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, yeah, I think I would. I mean, I do kind of want to go back to this notion of trying to figure out the best way to do things, because while the space moves so quickly, there are so many challenges when it comes to the structure around DAOs and doing simple things like trying to figure out how to deal with fiat, trying to figure out how you deal with banking, trying to figure out how you deal with reimbursements. Like, there are all these different challenges within DAOs that don't have ready Web3 solutions. So while the space is moving really quickly, there are things that would normally be, in the Web2 space, super quick to spin up that it will take you much longer to try to work through as a DAO, to figure out how you can do it in a compliant way, dealing with I don't want to say the real world, but dealing with the outside of Web3 world.
Yeah, I think that's an understatement and a half once you get into it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we're trying to figure out how to do healthcare for the DAO. And that's a great example of it, where if I was at a Web2 company, I would use a Web2 HR solution like Bamboo. I would use a Web2 payroll solution like Gusto. I would have our healthcare spun up, and I'd probably have all that done, bank accounts, everything done in less than a month. It's not that way in this space, and we will have been working on trying to figure out how to get healthcare for the DAO for about 6 months at the end of this month, but we'll have a solution in place, we think, by the end of the month, which is crazy. I mean, it's crazy. It's great, and other DAOs will be able to use it, but that's a really long time to try to kind of think through a Web3 solution for a DAO.
One of the challenges that I've sort of seen in this increased attention and excitement about DAOs is that there is early on, when it was still fairly nascent, and I'll even go just maybe a year ago, it wasn't the sense of like overinflated expectations around DAOs. Like, you could really clearly experience the limitations of it, especially if you're early on to a number of these communities. And then today there's like everything's a DAO and people are talking about DAOs and DAOs and DAOs. And so I think there's this new mainstream attention that's coming in, or early majority attention that's coming in, that I worry kind of has a miscalibrated view of like where we're actually at with DAOs. So I think that story around the complications of even just setting up healthcare, you're not even talking about legal structures, so there may be some around that, and banking, et cetera, et cetera. The TLDR there is like, it is still incredibly new. And I think one of the challenging things that work in this space is that you could go do 6 months of working on that specific thing, and it could be wrong 2 months from now. And so we just need to be in that space of like discovery and co-creation that I think is going to exist for some period of time.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's part of why it's taken us a little bit longer than I had hoped, because I think we've tried to do a really good job in thinking through all of the potential pitfalls of some of the decisions that we make in that space and weighing every option. So I would argue, on the healthcare front, I probably spent 2 months just digging into the existing solutions to finally realize there's no existing solution that will work for us, so we need to work with someone to create our own.
The build versus buy, but across every single aspect of an organization, not just your software. Sounds fun. That's what you signed up for, right?
Yeah. Some of it is really fun. Like I think something like a FWB spinning up Gatekeeper is really, really exciting, where FWB spinning up healthcare is kind of exhausting. You know what I mean?
There are a number of members on our team that I think will find that far more exciting than Gatekeeper. So love that work, and I think it's going to be foundational. And I think that's like when I think about the disruptive nature of DAOs, I think many think about funding, et cetera, in these large organizations. I think figuring out those specific things are going to have some of the biggest impacts on the space generally, as it is such a big barrier, and solving it reduces so much friction to getting more people into the space and having more builders and more innovation, which is ultimately, I think, what we need.
I agree. And I think for us, the healthcare thing is so important because it kind of comes back to building Web3 in a way that we want, right? So in an ideal world, everyone has healthcare. So figuring out how we can do it, and hopefully that can translate to other DAOs to be able to do it, makes not only our DAO better, but it makes the entire ecosystem better. So that is something that's pretty exciting to us, for sure.
I'm constantly in shock at the fact that the United States doesn't have universal healthcare, and so it's a thing that I appreciate is probably super relevant for you. And at the same time, the freedom that universal healthcare has provided for me in Canada is really tough to overstate.
I agree. I think the lack of universal healthcare in the United States really stifles innovation.
Incredible.
I really do.
Totally agree. So maybe speaks to the value of creating that space for people's genius to really manifest. Could be one of the big unlocks from DAOs. Look at this, DAO solve everything, Patti. That's our solution here, and love that we're on the same page.
I feel like Seed Club is going to solve a lot of stuff. I'm really excited.
We're working on it. Okay, to change tax here a little bit, over the last few months has been a very almost contentious sort of time in the crypto space. There's sort of a number of more challenging sort of social contributor code of conduct type of conversations that have merged in ENS and with FWB and in many others. What it's sort of done is really refocused, I think, some of the best teams thinking through what infrastructure is required to create a safe and effective space for people to come together and bring their full selves to this work. I'm curious, going into whatever detail you feel comfortable with, like how are you thinking about creating that sort of that sinew or structure that allows a community like FWB to kind of come together around these sort of shared values and norms and ways of being, and maybe specifically how that relates to dealing with some of the conflict that is inevitable in these organizations? So
one of the things that we did before our own internal situation had popped up was the DAO itself came up with a code of conduct that was pushed out and voted on to be ratified by the DAO. that basically outlined our values, outlined behaviors and actions that were not welcome as part of the community, and outlined a process as to how to deal with potential infractions as they came up. So we were really lucky. The community had ratified that. So when an issue came into focus, there was a process around it that ended up, rather than it being a crisis for the DAO, there was a process to govern it and figure out what the future was for the DAO regarding that member.
Do you see like code of conduct as being like an essential part of a new DAO stack, or should it have been prioritized sooner? Did it come at the right time? How are you thinking about like when a community should engage in code of conduct type structures?
I think it depends on your community. We were getting to a point where we were becoming so large, and while we didn't have a lot of issues, a couple of things popped up where team members felt like we probably needed some sort of process in place to sort of think through it. The code of conduct that FWB put forth is a CCO. So any DAO can grab it and fork it and make their own code of conduct pretty easily. I was really impressed with the way the community reacted to it. I was also impressed that we had a process in place to deal with it. I think not something that we had anticipated needing, but it happens. And I would urge most DAOs to sort of think through what that looks like for their own DAOs. So that way they have a process in place as well if an issue comes up.
There's two big values that come out of being clear around it. One is like people understand the nature of the game being played, and so there isn't any surprises. But two, from like an operational standpoint, having a process that kind of creates space and time and fairness, I think, in how it's addressed is so valuable, both from like I'm sure a practical sense of like you sitting there on Twitter when an issue arises and how do you message and sort of manage through it, and being able to point to a process is key. And then also to ensure that like, there's these sort of weird potential governance risk areas that come up around social attacks, et cetera. And it's kind of crazy to think through like the number of different vectors that you kind of need to be thinking about and how to kind of maybe slow some decisions down. And I think a process is pretty powerful for there. So it's something that we're deeply involved in and are collaborating with a number of DAOs on as well, is to try to just make it a little easier for our teams to inherit something that they can use and maybe make small changes to. And I think the FWB and sort of like it's leaning on a broad swath of work in open source development, I think, from my understanding, right? Like the code of conduct that you guys are actually using has histories back in open source world. So yeah, super valuable. I want to shift gears one more time. I think one of the things that I've admired the most from early contributors in the DAO space is just their commitment to making it easier for other talented people to kind of come into the space. Usually that involves, a lot of sort of education and communication, folks coming onto podcasts like this. I sort of think about like people as early members paving the way for the next generation of folks who come in, and maybe generations are just like distinguished by months, not years or decades, as they would be in the traditional world. I'm curious, how have you sort of thought about making it easier for the next Patti to come in and participate in the DAO ecosystem?
Boy, I think generally working through some of the operational issues that I've been working on for FWB, I think is just going to help not only the next Patti, but it's just going to help onboard a lot of different people that are not from the Web3 space into the DAO space. I think, and again, I know we had touched on this earlier, but I think the healthcare thing is really important. I think working through benefits and allowing more security and easier processes. The Web3 is still a little janky, I mean, I remember when I set up my first wallet and I just was like, I don't know what this is. This seems a little weird and it doesn't seem particularly slick, which, doesn't necessarily give people a lot of confidence. But I think our product team making beautiful products that I think will instill some confidence. I think the DAO itself working through things like healthcare and legal structure and all of those things is going to help onboard hopefully a ton of people into this ecosystem, and will also hopefully, help other DAOs. We really do genuinely try to share as much knowledge as we have with folks that ask, and I'm constantly making introductions to people in the space that have been particularly helpful to FWB and to the operational things we've been working on.
Yeah, I can attest to the immense support and sharing of knowledge that that you and your team have sort of participated in, especially with C Club. So big thanks for that. It's hard to overstate the impact that having an example can have on a space. If I think about some of the inflection points over the last couple of years as it relates to Seed Club, I think FWB plays such a major role in one of the bigger inflection points, which I would say sort of for us was like between SCO2 and SCO3. This is shortly following a fundraise that FWB did, and I think it's sort of like the legitimacy of this space, of what could be done in the space, I think was really impacted positively based on the things that you and your team have been doing. And so I think like that happens sort of on a macro scale, but also on a more micro scale as all these sort of new features, tool sets, experiments kind of come out and gain traction. And I think it's the big thing that we're involved in at C Club is want to just continue to provide more and more and more examples such that people feel more confident and can see themselves in building in the space. But I think it can be very small things that don't feel like they are big that can actually be that big unlock. So much love and appreciation for all the work that you and the FWB team has done and the benefits that I think it's created to bring so many more talented, creative individuals into the space.
I think really without DAO sort of thinking through a lot of these things, we're going to miss some talent. So it's exciting that everyone, including C Club, is sort of working towards making the ecosystem more stable, a more welcoming place for folks that want to shift into the space.
Yeah, I love that. Well, this has been a lovely conversation. I love coming into these and just being like, I am fascinated. I have so many questions. Let's see where the conversation goes. I hope, at least in just sort of reflecting on our brief conversation here, there's sort of this interesting mix between somebody who's both an early contributor and sort of finding their feet in the space, and also somebody who's very active in building the processes and structures to bring new folks into operational roles or contributor roles within your organization. So I think that's kind of an interesting conversation space for us to have explored. I'm sure people will find it very valuable. Where should people, well, this is your time to shill, Patti. Where can people find you on the internet? And like, is there something that we should direct their attention to this month?
If you want to find me, you can find me on Twitter. I'm Ratty Mouseman, which rhymes with Patti Hauseman, RATTYMOUSEMAN. And obviously, I would urge folks, if you have the time and inclination, to look into any of the folks out there helping facilitate crypto donations to the folks in Ukraine. I think it's been really heartening to see the Ethereum community coming together and already raising, I think, close to $6 million for Ukraine in a short time. But I know that more resources are needed. So that would be my shill. Is please support Ukraine if you can.
Ukraine DAO, one of the good places to go do that. It's some good overlap between FWB and C Club with some of those folks that are launching that. So amazing.
Fully agree.
Awesome. Well, Patti, appreciate your time. You've been very generous with us over at C Club. And so thank you for that. And yeah, I look forward to publishing this episode and continuing to bring incredibly talented individuals into the space that you and I care so deeply about. So appreciate you, and we'll see you on the internet.
It was an honor to be invited to be on, Jess, and thank you so much for your time. And I feel like Seed Club is probably one of the most exciting DAOs in the space. So grateful I had the opportunity to talk to you today.
Thanks, Patti.